Does Pete Sampras have a next-gen forehand? I know this is a weird question, so let me give you some context. I recently released a video explaining why so many players nowadays use the next-gen forehand and the next-gen two-handed backhand. And in the comments section, people were saying that Jannik Sinner does not have a next-gen forehand, even though I used him as an example of a next-gen forehand in the video. And people were also claiming that Pete Sampras has a next-gen forehand, and people were talking about the elbow position on the take back, which is supposedly a characteristic of a next-gen forehand. And I want to clarify whether the elbow position plays a factor in the next-gen forehand, and it does not. So it is absolutely correct that Pete Sampras has a high elbow position on his take back. So it's almost as if he's elbowing somebody in the face when he takes his racket back. He's not the only one with this style of take back. But as Sampras takes his racket back, he drops it with the tip of the racket pointing straight towards the back fence. Now in my video, I explained that the next-gen strokes, forehand and two-handed backhand, look whippier because the racket has to cover a longer path to get into the lag position. So let's take Pete Sampras as an example, who absolutely does not have a next-gen forehand. Despite his elbow being high, he drops the racket in the back. The tip is pointing straight towards the back fence. And when he initiates the forward movement of the racket, there's minimal movement if you pay attention to the tip of the racket. As opposed to Jannik Sinner, who drops this racket with the tip of the racket pointing towards the side. When he gets into the lag, the racket has to cover a lot more ground. And for that reason, it looks whippier as he accelerates into the contact point. I want to reiterate one important point that I made in my next-gen video. Style is something that has to suit each individual player, while fundamentals are technical elements that every player should possess. And while there are important differences between the next-gen forehand and the modern forehand, or the next-gen two-handed backhand and the modern two-handed backhand, players that utilize these strokes possess proper fundamentals. Now, is it okay to adapt someone's style? I think it's perfectly fine to experiment with different styles and find one that suits you best. This is most evident on the tennis serve, but it also applies to the forehand and the backhand. And I work with players of all ages and all levels. And I recently had a super interesting conversation with a 10-year-old student of mine who's a very talented player and has been playing tennis for about a year and a half. And I was doing a drill where we were working on defensive backhands. And all of a sudden, this player started pulling out the open stance two-hander. And after the drill, I asked him, did somebody teach this to you? Because he had worked with other coaches in the past. And he said no. So I asked, did you see this on TV? Maybe you watched Alcaraz or Sinner and you tried it out yourself? And he said, yes. So there's a thing in tennis called mirroring, and it is a real thing. Players will try different styles that they maybe have seen from other players, and they will make their own versions of that style. Because guess what? No matter how hard you try to copy a specific style, it's never going to be 100% accurate. Because let's face it, when you take your racket back on the forehand, for example, you are not conscious of how the racket is positioned exactly, especially in the fast part of the stroke, so towards the bottom portion of your racket drop, where the acceleration is very fast, but a place where you could be more conscious of your backswing, where the racket doesn't accelerate fast, is the loop and the top portion of your drop. But even here, you're not exactly looking at your racket as you're taking the back. You're looking forward at the ball. So you're basically doing this blindly. So when you're copying a specific style, in your mind, you have an idea of what it's supposed to look like. But in reality, the way you are copying that style, you're actually making your own version of it. And if we go back to a next-gen forehand video that I made a couple of years ago, I talked about a quote from Boris Becker. And he said that if you look at the top 100 forehands in the world, you're going to see 100 different styles, and that's very much true. So the next-gen forehand is a style, no doubt about it. And the message in the video is a very important one, because some players are forcing a style upon themselves that might not necessarily suit them. I give an example of some players are really badly trying to execute a next-gen forehand, and because the racket has to cover more ground, they end up not lagging the racket. That's just one example of many where you can make your forehand worse with a specific style. You can also start being late on your forehand because the racket has more ground to cover. So it's not smart to copy a style that makes your game worse. But the message goes deeper than that. The thumbnail asks the question, is this wrong? And the answer is, the NextGen style is absolutely not wrong. This is the natural evolution of the game of tennis. So if somebody has a NextGen style, whether this is something that happens naturally, which is true in most cases, or if somebody is trying out the NextGen style and is having success with it, in other words, you have a fundamentally sound forehand, as I explained in that NextGen video, then there's absolutely nothing wrong with adapting a NextGen style. And some people also talked about the categorization of different strokes. And to me, it's crystal clear. And I'm in the process of making a longer video on this subject. Robert from Crusher Tennis, who I featured on my channel in the past, gave me a super interesting book. It's an instructional book from 1970, and the teaching methods in this book are very interesting. So obviously, the tennis that's being taught in that book is classic tennis with classic strokes. This is going back to the wooden racket era. Now, what came after classic tennis is modern tennis. And of course, modern tennis is not necessarily going to get stuck. Players are naturally going to adapt some new techniques. Now, of course, the difference between classic techniques and modern techniques are much bigger than the differences between modern techniques and next-gen techniques. The differences between modern and next-gen are very nuanced. Let's go back to the forehand. I talked about the ground the racket has to cover from the bottom portion of the racket drop into the lag is my main categorization for a next-gen forehand. Now, on the modern forehand, you're going to see many different styles. You're going to see a WTA forehand, and even some male players take the racket behind the body on the racket drop, and they lag the racket from here. Other players take the racket straight towards the back fence, drop it here, and initiate the lag from this position. Most players will drop the racket on their side, and the racket will be pointed towards the corner of the back fence, and they will initiate the lag from this position. So the difference between a next-gen forehand where the racket is pointed straight to the side, or a modern forehand where the racket is pointed more towards the corner of the back fence, we're not talking about a big difference. It's a very nuanced difference. But it is a difference nevertheless. And that's why I'm categorizing it as next-gen, because we're seeing the exact same thing on the backhand side. Players are not accelerating from this position as much as they used to. Now, more and more players are accelerating their racket from the side and getting more whip prior to going forward. Now, when it comes to the orientation of the strings and the wrist usage on the next-gen forehand, it is interesting that next-gen players will turn the strings backwards. And if you think about it, it puts the wrist in a more extended position, the same position you reach when you end up lagging your racket. And if you try to do a next-gen preparation with a flat position of the string bed, where the tip of the racket is pointing straight towards the side, the wrist being straight in this position makes it more difficult to get into the lag position. Now, naturally, when players turn the strings backwards, the elbow also goes up. Of course, it's possible to keep the elbow low like Sinner does. But some players will incorporate this turning of the strings towards the back fence with a higher elbow position as well. Now, mind you that there's really not that much difference between a Tiafoe forehand and a Sinner forehand regarding the elbow, because while Tiafoe starts high with the elbow and his racket is actually beneath the level of his handle on the takeback, and Sinner is much lower in this regard, they both achieve the same position of the racket head on the bottom portion of the racket drop. So Tiafoe is obviously not going to hit his forehand from here unless he's hitting it extremely high. He's going to drop his racket down, and he achieves the exact same position that Sinner's in. The only difference is that Sinner loops and then goes lower from the get-go. So in the near future, look out for a video where I'm going to discuss the evolution of tennis technique between the classic technique, the modern technique, and the next-gen technique.